Okay, that's a very tough act to follow because all I'm trying to do here is to quantify the environmental cost of particular AI training models. Sorry, I'll just move this out of the way so that you can see. My name is Juno. I'm a fourth-year student in the Sustainable Development Program at Columbia. And here, what I want to do is maybe to complement what Eddie has done in terms of the overall labor impacts. Let me also do this. What I'm trying to do is to look at AI training models and compute the environmental costs. That's all I'm trying to do in this project. But in order to do so, what I'm trying to do is to estimate the emissions impact of AI training by looking at specific locations and specific models. And the location seems to matter, as Eddie has presented earlier, but also because of the fact that the emissions ratio based on the location actually differs quite a lot, depending on which grid you're connected to. What is a little bit less documented, if I'm trying to be a little bit bold, is that there might be indirect effects of the AI training through the electrical congestion because of the fact that AI training typically takes place in a very concentrated manner in a potentially very large concentrated load connected to a very small set of nodes, in the sense that, and through this, potentially congestion is one of the mechanisms that could matter in this matter. So in order to answer this question, a very simple question of how much emissions are being caused by AI training, what I'll try to first do is to see whether AI training by congestion affects generation or prices. In order to do so, I'll try to identify the nodes that are similar in congestion dynamics, which is a method adapted from Godin and Ibrahim's 2021 paper. And then I'll try to estimate generation effects of those that are close to electrically to the data center, whether they have more byte in generating more electricity for the data center's load using continuous diff and diff, and then try to see whether there are any impacts for the marginal congestion component and the locational marginal prices through the interrupted time series. And then I'll be able to sort of infer the spatial load origins from these diff and diff estimates. If they do not have a byte, then I'll just try to distribute them sort of uniformly across the grid. But regardless of whether it has byte or not, I'll be able to sort of quantify the emissions impact using the Hausman 2025 model, where transmission can be either unconstrained or constrained, which I'll try to describe in a little bit more detail later on. Preview results in terms of the baseload commitment. In terms of the grid, we do see a significant increase in the baseload commitment of these local fossil plants, especially for the Gemini 1 model, which is the larger model that I'm going to look at today, and not so much for GPT-4, unfortunately. But here's what I'm calling the environmental cost paradox. First of all, the accounting that is done by the corporate world and the engineering world seems to be very much lower than what I'm calculating. It's 2 to 14 times higher in my calculations. In terms of the intensity, emissions intensity, it's much more realistic than what the corporate side seems to report, which is very much heavily optimistic on the renewables availability. The other spatial divergence paradox, which I'm calling it this way, is that congestion seems to lower emissions in terms of CO2, but it seems to raise emissions in terms of local pollutants like SO2 and NOx, which I'll get to in a little bit. The potential contributions I'm hoping to have are understanding the impact of data centers, but also I think I'm bold enough to say that I'm trying to understand the impact of AI training by way of econometric identification as much as possible. And then secondly, perhaps this is a more grid level or bigger takeaway, is to understand the marginal emissions to non-marginal changes. I think there's only been a few papers that directly study concentrated load increases and grid dynamics, as well as local congestion as opposed to global congestion. And so I think that these two are the potential contributions that I have. As for the target AI models, the reason why I am focusing on these two models is because I'm able to say with enough confidence about the power draw, total data center capacity, when the timing of these training has been done, and where the location is, where these training cycles have taken place. For the other various models that you see these days, they do not disclose at all about where they were being trained, how much time it took. So I'm going to focus on these two models. I have maybe 5 models more that I'll present in the latter slides, but these are the ones that I'll focus on regarding the econometric identification part. As for whether renewables or fossil assets are more available in this area, I will define electrical closeness or proximity in detail in a little bit. But if we look at the Iowa Council Bluffs data center in which the Gemini 1 model was being trained at, we do see a lot of renewable assets being electrically close and able to be dispatched to this area. Similar, very close, another Iowa data center. I don't know why these data center companies are all in Iowa training these models, but very close geographically. But in terms of the electrical distance, we have more fossil than the other data center that we just looked at earlier. I'll just skip this in the interest of time, but what I wanted to say in this slide is that you might hear these reports about AI models being trained in multiple sites. In the models that I'm going to look at, it's sort of an illusion in the sense that they might be trained in different buildings, in different clusters. But when you look at the electrical connection to which the node is, to which these data centers are connected to, they're all connected to a single node. So in terms of the grid, they're very concentrated, despite the fact that they're utilizing multiple buildings and whatnot. Data assembly-wise, very standard. I'm going to be just using the emissions data from Puddle and SEMS, price data from the MISO and Southwest Power Pool data set. Renewables, I think maybe this is relatively new. They have a generator level hourly wind and solar utilization information. These are estimates, but I think they track very well. This is from PNNL. With the EIA data set that has regional hourly and wind and solar utilization information. And so maybe this is going to be useful for some of you. As for the cost, I'm again very much following the standard calculations in terms of the marginal cost of electricity. So in terms of the electrical or congestion proximity, the goal here is to identify which nodes are electrically constrained together, in the sense that if they're constrained together, they will likely move together. The key challenge there is that I don't have the physical transmission sensitivity data because that's behind the critical energy infrastructure information, which as a Korean, I'm not able to get. But the data-driven solution that I adapt from Golden and Ibrahim is to decompose the marginal congestion component into the part that, I don't know if you can see this very well, into the part that is more akin to line sensitivity, which is the loadings vector, and then the shadow price. I'm just going to take the loadings vector because that's the analog that I want to get, the power transmission distribution factor. And then I'm just going to calculate the cosine similarities between the data center node and each of the generator node, because that's all I care about at the moment, whether a power plant or a generator is going to respond strongly to the fluctuations of the data center's load. So that's the congestion proximity that I'm going to run with today. Of course, it has its own problems because PCA assumes orthonormal bases, as opposed to the power transmission distribution factors. They don't have anything about that, so that is a downside to this. And if I'm trying to utilize this as a sort of treatment intensity in terms of the continuous diff and diff that I'm trying to run, I will only have to restrict myself to the pre-AI training data to calculate these congestion proximities. But I try to make sure that if you click on these two notes, which I'll skip, you will be able to see that at least in terms of correlation wise, they're pretty stable. So very simple empirical strategy is to use continuous diff and diff as where the electrical or congestion proximity is used as a treatment intensity, and I'm going to try to measure it for every single hour of day as opposed to having like a lump estimate for the entire day. So I have hourly measures of utilization in terms of megawatt hour generated divided by megawatt capacity as the left-hand side variable. It's hourly, so megawatt capacity times 1 hour is megawatt hour. So we don't really need to take that too seriously. But I can also do the same exercise using the extensive and then intensive margin to see whether it was the extensive margin of plants entering more to meet the demand of the data center, or is it the case that the already on plants were the ones that are going to respond more to the AI data training? Any questions so far? Sorry if I'm going too fast. Okay, very standard. ITS, please take this with a chock full of salt because I don't particularly believe what I'm doing here, because it's more of an event study without a credible control group. But what I'm trying to do here is to try and get at the average shift in price or price component attributable to the AA chaining period using the standard identifying assumptions.
I think some firms publish their like training logs on GitHub.
Oh, really?
That help? Like, I think they have definitely some of these data, but they're like too big. I never.
Okay.
I think if you just search like AI training log on GitHub, maybe they have some.
Training log.
Training logs, yeah.
I see. So I do have that for the llama models. The llama models are kind of the reason why I didn't include them is because of the fact that the pre-training is very. So one thing that I should have mentioned is that the two models that I'm going to present today, I have very high confidence that before they were doing their training, there was no AI training happening at the same data center, as opposed to the llama models. They were ongoing with like years and years of like continuous training activity at that data center. So I don't really have a clean pre-period as opposed to these two models. But I'll check this thing as well. Thanks very much. Okay. So for the Gemini 1 model, the big takeaway is that I don't see anything with GPT-4, but I do see a lot with Gemini 1. I do see about 5 percentage points increase in the total utilization across the baseload plants. If I try to contain myself to the intensive margin impacts seem to be concentrated during the off-peak hours in which the data center load is continuous. However, the overall grid's demand is muted. But in any case, we do see a huge extensive margin impact, suggesting that there are more plants that are responding to the data centers, hungry data centers demands in terms of electricity. I don't see any impact from the peaker plants, except for maybe that peak over there, which is statistically insignificant, but it is sort of overlapping with that period where the data center demands are still high, as opposed to the overall grid's demand being muted. And again, as I advertised earlier, nothing from GPT-4. And I'm trying to say, before I get there, regarding the ITS results, which again, please take this with a lot of salt, but what I'm seeing is that there is increased congestion from the larger model, Gemini 1, as opposed to nothing coming from the GPT-4. But also, I must mention that these two timeframes have very different fuel and electrical conditions because of the fact that this period was coinciding with the gas price surge due to the war in Ukraine. And so that's something I think is different, but I think it's suggestive that maybe larger load leads to more congestion, which makes sense, but also it's very suggestive. So I'll just power through. Do I have 15, 10 minutes? 15 minutes. Okay. So far, the brief discussions, we do see stronger off-peak response from the baseload plants, about 5 percentage points more utilization per 1 standard deviation in terms of congestion proximity. I do see some evidence of elevated congestion supported by the nodal price evidence. And for GPT-4, no significant hour-of-day variation, despite the fact that I tried to run this. But what I'll do there is because I can't really pin down where the dispatch is likely to come from, I will just be uniformly sort of dispatching it. What I mean by that is, if it were, so we know that which plants are more likely to share the same congestion dynamics with the data center. And we know from the continuous diff and diff model, if you believe my estimates, at certain hours, there are more likely to be responses from the plants sharing these similar congestion dynamics, which we can infer the spatial load origins from. But if not, if there is no such response, as in the case of GPT-4, I'm just going to distribute within viable subregions as much as possible by capacity. This is what I call like uniform distribution, although it's not uniform because it's abiding by the fact that there are different capacities across these regions. So if it is the case that the spatial origins are traceable, I'm going to say, I don't know if this is very visible to you, but I'm going to say these bigger blue dots get the larger share of the load that is attributable to them. These smaller red dots actually decrease in their attribution. But if it is the case that it's not traceable, I'm going to just distribute that evenly across the space, abiding by the fact that there are differences in capacity. And then I'm going to utilize the Hausman 2025 model. The unconstrained model, it's just assuming that the electricity can flow freely without any transmission constraints or congestion considered, which is less realistic than the constrained model, which he introduces in the paper. So the problem there is that in her paper, she also does not have information about transmission constraints or like the transmission dynamics. But the key idea from that paper or the previous paper that she built on is that whatever the observed regional generation is, it should embody the transmission and congestion dynamics. So what that means is that although that model is not really able to tell us which region the electricity is going to, we can infer that using the observed generation of that region. So if that doesn't register that well to you, another way to look at that is to say, in the unconstrained model, every region shares a single merit order curve with the demand intersecting the merit order curve, as opposed to the constrained model. Each region has its own merit order curve, and the merit order curve is going to intersect at the observed generation. So that's one way to look at it. And in terms of the emission decomposition, what I'll try to do is to get at the total effect of AI training by subtracting the emissions using the constrained model using the observed demand and load. And then I'll try to generate a counterfactual emission from a no AI training scenario based on, this is my best guess, using the continuous diff and diff results that I mentioned earlier. Taking those parameters, trying to get at the spatial load origins, and then taking the difference between the two to get at the total effect, yes.
I might have sort of got a little bit confused. In the diff and diff, are the control nodes also nodes proximate to data centers? Or
I take all nodes.
Because I was thinking like there's a base load that they always have to respect. Like they can't shut down data centers.
Right.
And it's possible that using the load of data centers doing non-AI training as the counterfactual is better than using all the load.
I see.
Like if I don't train the model, I want to maybe still use my capacity for something else. that might lead the load to be a little bit higher than the counterfactual load for all of the other nodes that are not having data center.
I see. I have not thought about that, but thank you.
Okay, all right.
Thank you for the comment. Thank you. Regarding the direct load effect, what I'll try to do is generate another counterfactual based on with the AI training load, but what I'll try to do is to spread it uniformly across the grid without the congestion dynamics involved. And then what I'll try to do is to take the difference between the two to get at the indirect effect through congestion. So this is looking at the observed generation and using my best guess at the spatial load origins. This is without any transmission involved. This is the impact that I'm trying to estimate using congestion, or with congestion, sorry. There are additional considerations that I try to do in terms of the dispatch model, which is just to use the less reliable unconstrained model and try to see what that emissions look like. The average emissions versus marginal emissions, this is to sort of address the idea that Google or Microsoft or OpenAI might not be the marginal. They might not think that they're the marginal consumers of electricity, but they should be considered as average consumers. So this is what I'm trying to do with the average versus marginal emissions, and that's also in the computation. The grand total is not very large. The number has been, if you've seen the previous versions of this presentation elsewhere, the number has been falling in terms of the total carbon that's attributable to AI training. But I think it's interesting to say that as opposed to the constrained uniform model that I mentioned that does not have any congestion involved, with congestion, we actually get lesser carbon, which suggests that maybe congestion sort of locks in the renewables or the cleaner technology that is nearby the data center and mobilizes them as opposed to relying on the larger grid. It's not to be the case for GPT-4, however, because of the fact that I think I'm still not really free from the fact that there was this gas price shock. And so most of the dispatchable energy that could have gone to gas actually went to coal. So this is the reason sort of why I'm seeing a larger emissions impact for GPT-4. But in terms of Gemini 1, where we did see an impact from the continuous diff and diff model that I just described, as well as some evidence regarding congestion, we see actually lower carbon footprints from these models. As for the local health pollutants, I thought that this was kind of like the paradoxical part where I would have expected, because the carbon is falling, that the local pollutants will also fall, but it's not really the case because of the fact that the local gas units tend to be the ones that might be cleaner in terms of carbon, but are actually doing less job in terms of things like scrubbers and whatnot. So at the intensive margin, these guys are the ones that are more dirty. If we look at SO2, I think this is coming from the fact that at the extensive margin, the coal that could have been turned off without the training is still being turned on. And so therefore we have an increase in SO2, despite the fact that we have congestion decreasing carbon footprints. I do additional calculations for the additional AI models that I don't really have information about a clean pre-trend. So that's why I didn't really include them in the continuous diff and diff and whatnot. But we do see similar results. I think the takeaway is on the next slide, where I try to be more judicious about like whether these corporate reporting the average emissions factors or emissions ratio is more reliable than what I have calculated. And this is a bold claim, but I would like to say my calculations are a little bit more realistic, at least in the sense that what we see from the Hausman models, the average emissions factors are telling us that at the margin, it's the coal and the peakers potentially that are responding to the AI demand, as opposed to the corporate claim, which has a very low emissions factor of ranging from 0.05 to 0.33 tons per megawatt hour. That would imply that the clusters run almost entirely on dedicated renewables or nuclear, which is maybe the claim that they would like to make because of the fact that they're engaging in a lot of these renewable PPAs and so forth and so on. But if we look at the grid's reality, it doesn't seem to be the case that what they see as the emissions factor is what we can see from the grid. Go ahead, 4 minutes. Okay. So the broader takeaway so far, I think, is that these models that I've focused on today are very small compared to the super large models that we're seeing, like Gemini 2.5, GPT-5, and so forth and so on. These models are much, much larger. The reason why I couldn't really include them in today's presentation, in addition to time constraint, is because of the fact that they don't really disclose anymore about where these were trained at, how much computation it took. And the industry estimates are ranging very largely. And so I didn't really include them, but we do have information about how much parameters that they have. And so it is very likely that the bigger, larger models that we see and use these days are likely to have a bigger impact on the grid if it is the case that they're concentrated. I did try to highlight a little bit about the engineering disconnect between what we can calculate using the economic models versus the engineering-based models. And I think there's a case for more distribution across the grid because of the fact that mitigating local carbon and health impact might require us moving from just concentrated data centers as opposed to spatially distributing them, or if it is the case that in some time frames there's more renewable availability, we should try to shift it so that it's flexible enough to align with the local renewable availability. And a final point, whether the companies are doing enough. Again, this is highly speculative, but using the emissions, using the carbon emissions that I computed and the SEC of social cost of carbon of 190 per ton megawatt, ton CO2. It's about $12 million in terms of damages, if we believe my estimates. But this is as opposed to $100 million that Google has invested so far. This is just one model. This is for the entirety of Google's operations. So please, I'm not trying to say anything, but you see my just whether the companies are doing enough or not.
Do you have some sense of how much of the compute is like temporally flexible? Like I feel like the AI people say none of it is because they have to run it when people are using the models, and that's like they don't have control over when the users are using it. Is that wrong, or do you think some of it's more flexible than I've heard?
I think training is flexible. I think they want to deliver their models as quickly as possible, so they say that it's not flexible. So you can freeze training and then try to train it at a different time, which is something that Rob Metcalf and I are trying to convince a company to do. So training is very much, I think, flexible. The inflexible part that potentially is problematic is inference, like everyday usage. And so there might be some incentives to sort of delay your response, as in like if you are like a regular worker, you might submit some job at like 6 p.m., take a break, come back in the morning and then retrieve your outputs. I think in that sense, it's flexible in the inference world as well. But I don't think there's any incentive structures at the moment to be able to do that at the moment. So in that, I think we have some ideas about how to try to incentivize more people to do that, but certainly at the moment, not very
So
flexible.
are you seeing any effects of storage? Because presumably if you have better storage renewables, you don't have to dig into the coal and stuff so much. Are you seeing any effects of that happening?
That I have not thought about. I don't really see a lot of storage in MISO, but I would see that it might be the case for ERCOT, like the Stargate clusters that they have down there, and so that perhaps is a future project. Thank you. I think I'm out of time, right? So I will conclude there with the next steps, but thank you very much for your valuable comments and thank you for paying attention.